Alan Dinn is a lifelong native of Port Washington and also an author and local historian who has written 2 books and published several magazine articles about the Purdy Boat Company. Alan is the grandson of Ned Purdy, the founder and first president of the Purdy Boat Company. His great uncle, Gil Purdy, was president of the firm when the legendary yacht Aphrodite was built and supervised her design, and his mother was the secretary of the firm and prepared all the contracts and specifications for the yacht. And today, Alan's going to share some of the fascinating stories and photos about the history of the Purdy Boat Company and the role they played in Port Washington's local nautical history. Alan has a bachelor's degree in aeronautical engineering from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and a master's in applied math from Stony Brook. After serving 4 years as an officer in the U.S. Air Force, he was employed at the Northrop Grumman Corporation, preparing plans and proposals for advanced aircraft and support systems. His love of genealogy and his writing skills led Alan to write articles about the Purdy Boat Company for the Journal of the Kaunik Peninsula Historical Society and for Wooden Boat magazine. The latter article, written in cooperation with Virginia Marshall Martis, led directly to his comprehensive history of the firm in his book, Boats by Purdy, which you can find in the back there, published in 2003. As a member of the Port Washington Library's Nautical Advisory Council, he advised on the library's Our Bay exhibit, highlighting the Purdy's contribution to local nautical history. And personally, as the staff liaison to the Nautical Council, I had the pleasure of working closely with Alan on a special community photo exhibit about Virginia Marshall Martis and the Marshall family and Marshall Marine. In his spare time, Alan is a Eucharistic minister and clerk of the vestry at St. Stephen's Church, right across the street here, which members of the Purdy family have attended for 95 years. He also enjoys birding and kayaking with his wife Sue and playing with his grandson. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Alan Dinn.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Holly, and the members of the library staff. If you'd been sailing on Manhasset Bay 50 years or so ago, you would have seen these buildings. This was the home of the Purdy Boat Company. The shop came to port in 1925, but the Purdys had been in the boat building trade for decades before that. The Purdy forebears were early settlers in the American colonies. They didn't come over on the Mayflower, but they weren't far behind. By the mid-1630s, they'd settled in Connecticut. And by the 18th century, many of them had moved as far west as Westchester County, New York. I don't want that. I mean, I don't want that picture yet. After the Revolution, the Purdy family split up in many different directions. One descendant wound up in Oregon, where he founded the company that made Purdy paintbrushes. Another family went into Western New York and then up to Ontario, and they founded the Purdy Fisheries, which is still active today. A third family settled in Pittsburgh, and one of their descendants is my good friend Peter Rowland of Port Washington. But my family, my particular branch of the Purdy family, were loyalists. They wound up in the Annapolis Valley of Nova Scotia on the Bay of Fundy. My great-grandfather, James Gilbert Purdy, was born in Nova Scotia in 1832. He was a mariner for several years, but later worked as a boat builder in New Brunswick, Canada. But by the 1880s, he'd come back to New York, where he worked for the CRE Boat Works as their shop foreman. James and his wife had 10 children. All except one boy who died in infancy were involved with the sea. All 4 of his daughters married seafarers or boat builders, and of the 5 remaining sons, 1 became a yacht master, 1 became an officer of 2 different City Island boat building firms before moving to Illinois, and the 3 remaining sons, Gil, Harry, and Ned, worked with their father at Consolidated. By the turn of the 20th century, Gil Purdy on the left had become one of the designers that Consolidated. I always like this picture because it shows a draftsman or designer at his drafting table in a full 3-piece suit. Engineers in my day did not wear 3-piece suits. Ned on the right, my grandfather, took over from his father as shop foreman. Some of the features of Gill's designs were still noticeable in Consolidated Yachts from the late 1920s, more than a decade after he left the firm. One of the Purdy's main clients at Consolidated was Carl Fisher of Indiana, one of the developers of the Indianapolis Speedway. He had the firm build him several yachts and at least one race boat. In late 1915, Fisher hired Gill and Ned Purdy away and set them up in their own shop in the infield of the Indianapolis Speedway. They started their first boats in that shop in the summer of 1916 and then moved to Miami Beach that December. They were only the second family to live year-round on Miami Beach. The first boat built under the Purdy name was this 50-foot yacht, Shadow 3. It was shipped by rail from Indianapolis to Miami Beach and completed there. The yacht is shown in U.S. Navy markings as a patrol boat during World War I. The Purdys built a number of boats in Florida, including Altonia, the oldest Purdy boat still in existence, built in Miami in 1919. It's currently located in Mount Dora, Florida. Notice on the lower right the bronze rudder, which is typical of many designs for most of their career. This is another of their Miami boats, the 55-foot Mary Ann, that was destroyed in an explosion in 1935. They also built some rather strange boats, such as these replicas of Venetian gondolas for one of the hotels on Miami Beach. And glass bottom boats. This is not a very good picture, but this were another boat type that they built for the Miami Beach hotels. By 1919, they were having trouble getting skilled mechanics and also getting paint and varnish to dry in the Florida humidity. So they moved their main shop to Trenton, Michigan, which was a suburb of Detroit. After they moved to Michigan, they built many kinds of boats, but their stock in trade were custom yachts like Shadow J. And the building in the background is one of the Purdy boat sheds in Port Washington. Just a minute here. Also in Trenton, they built race boats like these 18-foot Biscayne Baby runabouts. The top photo shows my Uncle Bob Purdy testing one of the boats before the Miami Regatta of 1925. He wowed onlookers by turning the boat in its own length at speed. The bottom photo shows the actual race. The boats were driven by race car drivers from the Indianapolis Speedway. But Fisher didn't like the boats, probably because the race car drivers didn't really know how to handle boats. So he pulled the engines out of the boats and chopped the boats up and had them burned. The Purdys later built another lot of Biscayne Babies in Port Washington. One of them was, excuse me, this laptop is not acting the way I want it to. They built another lot of Biscayne Babies in Port Washington. One of them actually wound up later belonging to Lawrence of Arabia. Carl Fisher and Caleb Bragg decided to hold the 1925 Gold Cup race in Manhasset Bay. Fisher saw the event as a way to promote his Bayview Colony development. And as part of that, he wanted his entry into the race to be built there. So in March of 1925, the Purdys were moved, took all the equipment and all the people from Michigan and set them up in this old airplane hangar in Bayview Colony. About the time they moved to Port Washington, the Purdys designed a few much larger steel-hulled yachts, like Shadow K, built by Consolidated in 1925 for Carl Fisher. In spite of its size, Shadow K was very much part of the Purdy design space. Fisher later sold this yacht to John Brinkley, a quack doctor, and Brinkley in turn sold it, according to the yacht license, into Venezuelan registry. For years, I knew nothing more about it than that. But after some diligent research, I came up with an article in Spanish telling about this boat's career as the presidential yacht of Venezuela. I managed, through a little help from Google Translate, to come up with a fairly good story about the yacht. Another one from that period was Harold Vanderbilt's Vara, a twin of Shadow K, which was built in 1928 by Herreshoff. The boat served as a Navy patrol boat in World War II. And after the war was sold to a Florida firm that used it to ship bananas from Central America. They renamed the boat Susie May Hamilton, but again, I could find no record of it after the war. But a recent search showed that the vessel struck a reef off Cozumel, Mexico in 1948 and sank. The Purdys had some hard times in Port Washington. First, late in 1926, their main customer, Carl Fisher, faced a financial crisis. He had been working to develop Montauk Point as a Miami Beach of the North, but the development never really came to fruition. He had financed the Montauk Manor using Miami Beach development as collateral, but when a hurricane crippled the Florida coast in 1926, his dried up. Fortunately for the Purdys, he'd set them up as a separate company at that time. Then in 1928, the whole wooden shop was totally destroyed in a fire. The Purdys remained there and they rebuilt. This is the same picture you saw before, but this is the shop looked like after they rebuilt it. And it was a iron frame building, and they clad it with this absolutely remarkable new material. It was clad in corrugated asbestos. Here in Port Washington, they kept on building world-class boats, Gold Cup racers like the 1929 winner Imp 2, seen here, restored in 2003, and the 1930 and 31 winner Hotsy Totsy. And the 50-foot hydroplane Rascal of 1929 for Caleb Bragg. Rascal later served as a rum runner and was reputedly burned to the waterline at 3 Mile Harbor on the South Fork to avoid capture by the Coast Guard. A few days ago, I was asked if the Purdy firm ever competed with Crestcraft. The obvious answer was no. Purdy boats were larger and custom built, and their clientele were more high-end, like people named Vanderbilt and Wanamaker and Whitney. But in 1929, Ned Purdy tried his hand at designing boats for the mass market. This 30-foot runabout was one of 3 models that Ned designed for the City Island firm of Lyon and Tuttle. A couple of hundred Sea Lions were built in the late 1920s and early 30s, but Lyon and Tuttle fell victim to the Depression. The firm went bankrupt in 1932. It's Lyon and Tuttle, not Purdy's. And the remaining hulls were sold without engines. There are still, to the best of my knowledge, there are still a few Sea Lions afloat today, and they are loved by their owners. All wasn't work at the Purdy shop. Here's a photo from the late 1920s of the Purdys and their chief client setting out to fish in Manhasset Bay. And if you'll just bear with me a second while I find the, no, I can't. Well, at any rate. That's the one on the far right is my grandfather. No, the one in the center with a pipe is my grandfather. The one on the far back, in the far stern with a hat on is Carl Fisher. They were heading out for a day's fishing in Manhasset Bay. Early in 1932, the Bank of North Hempstead closed its doors. The Purdy firm had their accounts at the bank and they got back 10 cents on the dollar at the time, although they did receive more later on. About a year after that, in March of 1933, my grandfather, Ned Purdy, died, and his brother Gil took over as president of the firm. For much of the Depression era, many of the Purdy customers could no longer afford custom yachts. The Purdys only built one boat for the whole year of 1933, and their main product for the next several years were Star-class sailboats. And the Starboat keel at the Baywalk, placed there to commemorate Ike Smith's boatyard where the first 22 stars were built, was actually from a Purdy-built star. Another boat from that period was Shadow Fay, which is seen here after the war during its service as the superintendent's barge at the U.S. Naval Academy. Then along came Jock Whitney. When Jock Whitney's father died, he left an estate worth $127 million, the largest estate in the history of the U.S. at that time. His widow and his two children, the proceeds, and Jock used some to buy a yacht from the Albany Boat Works. He named this boat Aphrodite II, in tribute to a much older Aphrodite, a steam yacht owned by one of his uncles. About the same time, Whitney's brother-in-law, Charles Shipman Payson, ordered a 90-foot diesel yacht from the Julius Peterson yard in Nyack that he named Saga. The brothers-in-law used to have friendly races to see which yacht could travel faster from Manhasset Bay to New York City. Payson's main claim later in years was as the owner of the New York Mets, which he inherited from his wife in 1975. All went well with Jock Whitney and his Aphrodite until Payson came along with a newer Saga that was faster than Jock's boat. So Jock started looking to replace his yacht. He set out specific requirements. If the boat didn't go at least 35 miles an hour, he would not have to pay for it. But for every mile an hour over 35, the builder would get a bonus. The only firm confident enough to meet his requirements or hungry enough for the work, but remember this was still the Depression, was the Purdy Boat Company. Jock Whitney signed a contract with the Purdys to build a new boat in the fall of 1936. Signing for the Purdys were Gil Purdy, the president of the firm, and Clara Purdy, my mother, the firm's secretary. This is a shot of the Purdy shop with the frames of Aphrodite early on in her construction. And this is a later shot as the boat is nearing completion. And this was just after her launch in Manhasset Bay in May of 1937. The boat was originally a light gray. It was not painted black, as we all remember Aphrodite, until the following year. Jock Whitney was one of the early backers of Technicolor. As a result, he became friendly with many Hollywood luminaries. And the boat played a host at times to people like Fred Astaire, Helen Hayes, Douglas Fairbanks, Katharine Hepburn, and Joan Crawford. Tallulah Bankhead was a frequent visitor, and rumor had it that she and Whitney were romantically inclined. This photo from my father's collection shows Shortly after the U.S. entered World War II, Yard President Milton Purdy met with the Navy Department. He said that the Purdys and other small yards could provide a needed capability for the Navy. But the Navy brass rebuffed him, saying they didn't have enough inspectors and auditors to support the smaller firms. Sometime later, they changed their tune, and the Purdys built 88 utility boats under Navy contract during World War II. This was the first of their picket boats launched in Port Washington in 1943. And they also built a number of smaller utility boats for the Navy. These are plane rearming and personnel boats in 10 or 12-foot boats, but they built quite a number of them. Several larger Purdy boats also saw wartime service. I already mentioned Vara, that served as a convoy escort. Others served the Navy and Coast Guard, mainly as harbor or offshore patrol craft. At the start of World War II, Whitney offered Aphrodite to the Coast Guard for service. The boat was used for several missions. It escorted the Queen Mary on her first voyage out of New York Harbor after the Queen had been refitted as a troop ship. Aphrodite's captain later recalled that he was given orders to ram anything that even remotely looked like a periscope. The boat was also used in sea trials of the PT boats. The PT boats could outturn Aphrodite, but Aphrodite could actually outrun a PT boat on the straightaway. And they were saying, the crew on one of the PT boats said, here we were trying to stuff down sandwiches, and the crew on Aphrodite had home-cooked meals. After the war, the Purdys built a few boats to other firms' designs, like the John Wells designed Seascape of 1946. And the 82-foot Philip Rhodes designed Constellation, shown here as Sorrento in the 1980s, as a charter yacht in the Caribbean. There's one last story for the Purdy design team. Aphrodite was the last boat designed and built by the Purdys. But in 1947, they designed a cruiser for John W. Stroh of the Stroh Brewing Company. The design was forgotten until the 1970s, when the boat was built by the Staudacher firm in Michigan. Zipper, with true Purdy lines, is now part of the fleet at the Antique Boat Museum in Clayton, New York. And we've seen it. Now back to Aphrodite. After the war, the boat was returned to Jock Whitney and was often seen in Manhasset Bay. Here's a photo of it on the ways at Purdy's in the late 1940s. And here it is in the bay in the mid-1960s. About that time, the boat was owned by a man from Sands Point who went by the name of Louis Moonfire. He was something of a strange character who later built an elaborate home in Topanga Canyon, California, that he called Moonfire Temple. He renamed the boat Moonfire, and for some reason he had the interior mahogany of the boat sandblasted. A later owner kept the boat at Jackson's Marina in the Hamptons. When one of the owners didn't pay his fees to Jackson's, the marina pulled the engines out of the boat, but forgot to close the hull up. The boat sank. It was later hauled out. This was her condition in the weeds in the Hamptons when a man from New Jersey found her and hired John Pannell of Port Washington to restore the boat. John was running Harbor View Marina in the old Purdy shop. He brought the boat back to Manhasset Bay on Thanksgiving weekend 1983 and started in restoring. The man from New Jersey died shortly afterwards, and his estate asked John if he would accept the boat in partial payment for work in progress. This is the bridge of Aphrodite under restoration, and this is a shot of the boat after John Pannell's restoration. Photographer Chris Bain, who now runs the local historical society, did a photo study of the boat after John Pannell's renovation for an article in Nautical Quarterly. Chris shared many of his photos with me when I was writing my book about Aphrodite's restoration. This is another one of Chris Bain's shot. John and his wife Marjorie took the boat to several boat shows after he finished the restoration. And he had lived aboard the yacht for several years, but was finally unable to keep it up. This is what the boat looked like when it was found in Palm City, Florida in the spring of 2000. That year, Pannell sold it to Charles Royce of Watch Hill, Rhode Island. Royce was the owner of a family of mutual funds, but also involved in historic preservation. Royce put together a team headed by his captain, Kirk Reynolds, to evaluate the boat. And this was some of what they found. Royce and his team brought the boat back up north. As it neared the end of its voyage, it passed under the Brooklyn Bridge on October 1st, 2000. And if you look carefully, you may not be able to see it clearly, but you can see the old twin towers in the background behind the Brooklyn Bridge. After a few years of deciding where to have the boat overhauled, Royce settled on the Brooklyn Boatyard in Brooklyn, Maine, founded by noted boat builder Joel White and now operated by Joel's son, Steve. As an interesting point for the library, Joel was a son of E.B. White, author of, among other books, Charlotte's Web. Here the old boat rests outside while awaiting space in the shop. Early on, White and his crew decided there wasn't enough good wood left in the old boat to make repairs practical, so they started a complete reconstruction. Since there were no detailed plans, they proceeded to measure the old boat and build a computer file. As they took the boat apart, they used it as a template for the reconstruction. The yard was able to reuse much of the brass from the original boat. All the portholes and most of the stanchions are original. They took the throttle quadrant, the brass throttle quadrants, stripped out all the innards, and put modern electronics in it, so you still have the same old quadrants that were in the boat in 1937. While we were in Massachusetts at a friend's wedding, we took a small detour and drove up to see the boat in progress. My first reaction going into the shop was that the sights and sounds brought me back to the times when I hung out around the Purdy shop as a child. I was awed by the craftsmanship and the attention to detail, and felt that if the Purdys had kept going until today, their shop might have looked like this one. And here their shop foreman, Brian Larkin, was showing my wife, Sue, some of the finer points of the restoration process. These are some views of the completed boat. The galley has all modern conveniences. The cabinet above the stove vent houses a microwave, and the counter in the foreground has a refrigerator freezer underneath. This is the main stateroom in the bow of the boat, and the hatch leads to a forward cockpit, which was a hallmark of many Purdy cruiser designs. And these, I tried my best to get photographs, good photographs of the engine room, but there is so much hardware in there, it's almost impossible to show. These are 2,000 horsepower Caterpillar diesels that could drive the restored Aphrodite at more than 40 knots. This was launch day. The day before the launch, Mr. Royce flew my wife and me and Ginger Martis to Maine for the festivities. We all went for a big party the night before the launch, and somebody commented on the big horns on the top of the boat. They got a set that were actually designed for a diesel locomotive, and someone asked the captain how they worked. He pulled the handle and the sound made a few of us jump and blasted a few birds and dust out of the rafters. Here is Aphrodite on the travel lift being lowered into the water. And Aphrodite at speed on launch day. This is one of my favorite photographs. This is the boat moored at the dock in Brooklyn the morning after the launch day, and the boat just seems to be looming out of the mist. In the spring of 2006, I had the opportunity to join the crew that brought Aphrodite from Brooklyn to her new home port of Watch Hill, Rhode Island. Imagine my joy when Captain Kirk Reynolds let me take the helm. I drove the cruiser across the Gulf of Maine for over an hour at an average speed of 27 knots. Kirk told me, he says, go ahead, he says, just keep the compass heading at 190, and the only thing you might hit is a lobster pot. This is the boat refueling at the eastern terminus of the Cape Cod Canal. And as we approached Watch Hill, Captain Kirk pushed the throttles forward. As we neared the harbor, he had the speed up to 35 knots. Smaller boats sped out of the way, but he finally had to throttle back as we neared the anchorage. And this is the boat at rest in her new home at Watch Hill, Rhode Island. And then since that day, Aphrodite has been seen in the waters around her home port and at other places in Long Island Sound. and in Florida during the winter months. She appeared at several boat shows like this one in Essex, Connecticut, drawing admiration wherever she went. One year we were aboard her as she sailed down the Mystic River in the seaport's annual boat parade. People along the shore used to hold up paper plates with scores on them. And I don't remember seeing anything less than a 10 for Aphrodite. The question remains, what is this boat? Is it the same boat that was launched in 1937, or is it a replica? The Antique and Classic Boat Society classifies this boat as a replica, but I think it's more than that. As I drove the boat across the Gulf of Maine, I felt not only the presence of the crew from the Brooklyn Boat Yard, but also of my great uncle Gil, my mother, and all those who designed and built the original boat for Jock Whitney. Aphrodite was the end of the old commuter yachts from before World War II. And that's my story. If you want to know anything else, look at the book. Thank you, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Alan. I have to say, we are so fortunate here in Port Washington. We have such a rich local history, a rich nautical history, and what a pleasure for us to have you here today sharing your story, your family's story, the story of Purdy Boat Company. And I just want to thank you again. Terrific presentation today, Alan.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah.
And thank you for helping me get the computer set up so this would
Sure.
kind
Yeah,
of
we
work.
had some technical hurdles as we got set up today, and I apologize for the little interference we were having with Alan's mic there, but again, terrific presentation. I want to thank, we're going to get to some questions in just a second. I want to thank the Nautical Advisory Council again for their sponsorship of today's program. I want to thank Hallie Byrne, Audra Signers here in the back as well, a member of the Nautical Council. And I will again just point out there are some copies of both Alan's book and some other local history books on the back table there. Those are circulating copies, so you're welcome to check those out. And in terms of some questions, actually one we had here in the chat is in terms of that opening photo where you showed the Purdy boat yards shown from the bay, can you orient us in terms of where the shop and those
Sure.
buildings were located? So in terms of, let's say, town dock, if you were to orient us from there.
It's at the foot of the bay side of Bayview Colony, just south of the Carl Fisher House. It's Manhasset Bay Yacht Club, Dolphin Green, then Bayview Colony, and then the Port Washington Yacht Club. There are $1 million townhomes on the site of the old Purdy shop, but some of the house on the site where the Purdys lived and where I lived until I was 2 years old is still there off South Court. So that's pretty much where it is.
Got it.
Not with me, but it was actually it was the original clubhouse of the Port Washington Yacht Club. But I have a photograph of it in my book, but it's not a very good photograph.
So if folks here have a question, just raise your hand. I'll be happy to come on over. Here we go. Hold on.
I have a question. I just to clarify your answer. My husband and I built a house on top of the land.
Here.
In fact, we had, my name is Linda Adams. My husband and I built a house on the land that was part of the Purdy boat yard. In fact, I had to tear down the Purdy boat yard in order to build the house. So anyway, if anyone goes into Bayview Colony, it's right next to the pool. If you just south of the pool, and then there's another house also.
Yeah.
And then right across the street from across the driveway from that is the old Purdy home that has now been renovated and expanded.
Terrific. Thank you. Thanks for that extra background.
Yes. As an aside, there was a tennis court on the property, and in the winters, my grandfather used to flood the court and use it as an ice skating rink. You know, my grandfather grew up in New Brunswick, Canada, and they would go to school on skates sometimes in the winter.
Wow.
Mr.
Yeah, well,
Thank you so much. We live in that house that you grew up in.
you do?
Yes.
Okay.
So we
Good.
were curious. We were always told that that house was transported from another location, built in 1880, but brought by barge to the current location. Now, you were only 2, but do you remember any of that?
No.
Okay.
I have an aerial photograph that shows the building in roughly its current location in like 1921. But I don't doubt it could have been brought from another site, but I really don't know.
So they brought the materials from across the bay to Bayview Colony to build the shop? Is that what you said? Or they brought it from someplace,
Well,
Michigan?
the original shop was a building that had already been there. It had been an old Curtiss airplane hangar that was used during World War I to train Navy pilots. But the Curtiss factory moved in the 1920s to Manhasset Isle, to what became the Pan Am facility on Manhasset Isle. And the Purdys went into an existing shop there, and then they rebuilt on the same site after the fire. I don't know how they brought all the materials there.
Well, you're invited anytime to come see the house.
Thank you. Actually, yeah, I didn't know the connection with the Port Washington Yacht Club until somebody told me. My grandfather on the other side, that my Dinn grandfather was a member of the Port Washington Yacht Club in its very, very early days. And he was the one who identified it as the house that had been their clubhouse.
You got any other good stories about Bayview Colony?
I could, but yes.
Yeah, another question over here. Hold on one sec.
Thank you. Did the Purdys build anything for the Navy during World War II?
Yes. I showed pictures of a few of them. I don't know if I can back up through this thing here. Hang on a sec. They built, I don't know how many boats they built. They built 88 boats altogether. Several were 40 to 50-foot patrol craft for using in harbors around Navy bases. And a lot of them were smaller utility boats, 10 or 12-foot runabouts that they could use to bring more ammunition to flying boats in their bases or what have you. There was a story going around for many years that the Purdys built PT boats, and that is not true, because I have a record of all the contracts they had with the Navy. And that was not them. Yes, Bob.
Hold on one sec. Mic around.
Do you know if any of the Purdy boats were ever used as rum runners besides the one that was burnt to the ground?
Yes.
Because my uncle used to get the stuff, he used to build the stuff down in his basement, and it would be taken out to a boat downtown Brooklyn, and they would put salt water on it. So I don't know if any of those boats might have been your family's.
I wrote an article, actually, one of the articles over there talks about the Purdy rum runners. Actually wasn't started as a rum runner. It was started as a 72-foot yacht, but it was sitting in the shop this is right at the beginning of the Depression, and somebody came in and decided they wanted to buy the boat. They built an armored wheelhouse on top of the boat. They put 3 airplane engines in it. And the Coast Guard eventually caught up with the boat, but it wound up serving as a Coast Guard cutter from 1933 to the end of World War II. And at the time, they had trouble with it because it was too high tech for the Coast Guard to keep up with. I have no idea what happened to it after the war.
Hi, Alan. I'm sorry I was late.
That's okay.
The Scoffiniches also built rum runners and Coast Guard boats.
Yes.
And they also used the similar kinds of engines, you know,
Yes.
for the rum runners. And the
Yes.
other thing that they did for the rum runners is they gave them a thing that created a smoke screen.
Yeah,
So
I've heard of that, yes.
Yeah, that's great.
So Alan, I know you mentioned on Aphrodite that it had not being a boater myself, maybe this is a common feature, but a forward cockpit. Is
Yes.
that a unique feature, or do a lot of
A
boats
lot-
have that?
A lot of Purdy boats did. I don't know if many others did, but it was a feature of many Purdy boats. You can see it there on Aphrodite with Shirley Temple. But if you go back here, where is the one I want? Well, you can see a little bit of one there, but this one, you can see it quite clearly. There's a little windshield, if you will, right at the front of the boat. And there's a small area there. There's a hatch that goes down into the stateroom, and there were seats in the cockpit. And a few of them, you could actually have controls there, but most of them, it was just you could sit there and enjoy the speed.
Oh, so it was seats, or was it actual controls of the boat?
Mostly it was just seats.
Got it. So Alan, what would you say, if you can tell us what you think really makes Purdy boats unique? I mean, I know you've researched these and their history, but what was it that made them stand out?
I'm not sure I can pick one particular thing. They were all really exceptionally well crafted. One of the problems they had after World War II was they couldn't get craftsmen to work on boats of that kind anymore. And the technology, the wooden boat building kind of fell apart with the advent of fiberglass and other materials. But they were all, very much handcrafted boats. I was aboard one of the Purdy racers that was restored in around the year 2000, and you could see, as you were down inside the hull, you could see the workmanship of the boat. There were still dings in the wood from hammers when they built the boat. And it was just a whole level of craftsmanship that every boat they built was the same level of detail.
Yeah, it's very clear from both the historical photos as well as the renovated photos of Aphrodite. It stands out. They're beautiful.
Yes.
Yeah. I do want to make a quick plug here for something else that has been an initiative of the Nautical Council, which is a historical walking tour app. In case you're not familiar with it, there's a sign and some information there at the back. But what this allows, it's an app that's free to use on your phone, and it will take you from basically Inspiration Wharf to Mill Pond. And as you walk along, it's GPS activated, and it will tell you about the history of this building or that building and what has gone on here in the bay. And it's just a slice of Port Washington's rich history, but I encourage you to check it out. It's a way to learn some more and dive a little deeper into some of Port Washington's local history here. So in terms of the work that you did with Ginger, can you tell us a little bit more about that? You said that she was really instrumental in you really pursuing writing and looking into your family's history.
Okay, well, I had known Ginger for a while, and actually what got me started on getting really involved with the boats was another woman named Louise Haney. And she used to write a column for the Port newspaper called On the Waterfront that was later taken over by Andrea Watson. And somebody found an old book that had the specifications of all the major Purdy boats. And that was published, that was an article about that in the Journal of the Historical Society. And Louise asked me to write an article about the family, not about the boats. But that's what really got me connected to the idea that my family built all these great boats. And then Ginger approached me once and said, you know, we should try to do an article about the Purdys for Wooden Boat Magazine, which is one of the standard boats of magazines rather, of that era, of that style. And so she and I wrote this article, a copy of it over there, and we went through 3 or 4 revisions of it. And when I got done, I said, you know, I had probably 2/3 of what I learned never made it into the article. So I said, I'm going to make a book out of this. And I wrote a whole version of it, then I wrote another version of it. And then I said, you know, this doesn't really work. I had all the information, so I just took everything apart. I put it back together in a whole different ordering. You know, there were 13 chapters. I broke it down into 6 chapters, reorganized. And that's what became the book that's over there, or back there rather. But Ginger was really the one who promoted me. She helped find a publisher for my first book, and she supported me, and I helped her with some of what she did over time. We had joint presentations here at the library, and I owe my whole quote-unquote career as a nautical historian mostly to what Ginger did.
Well, I guess we want to thank Ginger, and of course thank you, Alan, that you put all this. I'm sure there's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that goes into researching and putting both of these books together.
I'm still finding out things.
Yes, that's the great part, right? There's
Yes.
always another story to be
Yes.
found and
Yeah.
another story
And
to be
that's
told.
one of the reasons I wrote some of the magazine articles. There were stories that just weren't there 15, 20 years ago when I wrote the books. And you can find things on the internet now with newspapers.com or whatever that you couldn't even find before. I never had any idea that I could find an article in Spanish about a boat that served as the presidential yacht of Venezuela. And I translated the article, Google Translate, paragraph by paragraph into English. And then I said, this is good English, but it's not good boat. So I rewrote some of the terminology into something that made sense from a boat. Yes.
I'm sorry, I came a little late. What is the connection with Purdy and Miami? How did that start?
Well, Carl Fisher at the time of, in the late 1910s, was developing Miami Beach. He basically found it was a sandbar out just off the coast of Miami. And he was interested in developing the area. He and friends of his had housing developments. They started having boat races rather, in Biscayne Bay. And so he basically moved the Purdys to Miami, and I think it was 1916. My mother always used to recall that she had to walk across the causeway to Miami proper to go to school, because there were only like two or three families on the island at that point. She was a teenager. My grandfather also had some troubles in Miami. He was a man of relatively dark complexion, and it's something that runs in the family because I've had other cousins who have similar complexion. Also, he worked in a boatyard outdoors probably 10 or 12 hours a day. And he had some trouble on some of the buses in Miami because of his complexion. There were them who didn't think he was a white man.
So it was your grandfather, Mr. Fisher, that had a connection that brought your
Yes,
family
yes.
down.
Fisher basically hired my grandfather and his brother and set them up in his shop. He founded the company. It was originally part of his Carl Fisher Enterprises, if you will, and he later let them go as their own company.
I lived in Miami not too long ago and on
Oh.
Biscayne Bay, and you have the Fisher Island.
Yes,
Does that have to do with who you're talking, like Mr.
Um,
Fisher?
I know the story of Fisher Island, but I don't really have it in my head right now. But he was one of the earliest developers of Miami Beach. And there's still somewhere on Miami Beach, there's still a Purdy Avenue, which is where the shop was.
Another question.
I understand from your great lecture here that the vessel now lies at Watch Hill.
Yes.
Can people visit it? And
You can certainly visit. I don't know if they'll let you
Put you
on
on.
it, but you can certainly see it up there.
second part of the question is, it's got to be extremely expensive to maintain.
Yes.
So where does the funding come from for maintaining the vessel at Watch Hill?
Well, the owner of the boat has the resources to do it. I don't know what the funding is, but he is the head of a family of mutual funds. And he is also involved in many other restoration processes. He restored the Ocean House Hotel in Watch Hill, and he's done other restoration work. And he's also been a devotee. At one point, he had 4 or 5 boats in addition to Aphrodite.
Great. So let me just check if there's any more questions in the chat. And again, I encourage you to check out some of the books and items and magazines that Alan has brought along with him. Let's see. Another question here. Were yachts like Aphrodite bought by clients who would handle them by themselves, or did these clients generally hire a captain and crew to navigate the boat while they enjoyed the luxury of the yacht?
By and large, the latter. Most of them had professional captains. Once in a great while, an owner would drive his own boat, but probably 90 to 95% of them they had professional captains.
Oh, we have another question back here.
That was fascinating. Out of my ignorance, I'm wondering if the Whitney you were talking about is the same one who was behind the Whitney Museum in the city. Is that the same family?
The same family, yes, not the same person.
Thank you.
Jock Whitney's family were basically one of the founding families of North Shore Hospital. You're welcome.
Terrific. Well, the more we learn about history, the more things are connected, that's for
Yes.
sure.
And,
Well, can we have another round of applause for Alan Dinn?
thank you, thank you.